All right, good morning. Thank you for that introduction. I'm happy to be here today. My name is Taylor Randall Singleton, and I am an Extension Sustainability Specialist at UGA based out of the Tipton campus. My area of focus is sustainability, but particularly I'm focused on pesticide stewardship because to me, the ability to have a sustainable farm, I know that's a very popular word these days, but to have a sustainable farm relies on the ability to continue producing a crop year after year that makes money. And that's how we keep our land and farming. And to me, that's true sustainability. So pesticide stewardship is the foundation of that. So that's the area that I'm really focused in my program. But today I'm going to give you an update on the Endangered Species Act. I know we are all so tired of hearing about the Endangered Species Act, but it's really important to know about the changes that are coming, what we can expect in the next couple years, and then kind of what we're looking at for the future. So we're going to talk about some of the changes that we're going to see with ESA and pesticide use, especially over the next couple years as these regulations come into reality. We're going to talk a little bit about the herbicide strategy, which is EPA's plan of how we're going to reach ESA compliance with pesticide use for the future. I'm going to share a little bit with you about what UGA is doing to help you all on the farm, and then how can you prepare for these changes ahead of time as we move into the future. So again, I know we have been sharing this with you for the last couple years. I just want to give you a little bit of a refresher in case you aren't familiar with what the Endangered Species Act is. But the Endangered Species Act is a federal law that was put in place over 50 years ago. This is a federal law that is put into place to protect species that are at risk of extinction. These species are known as listed and endangered species. And really, this is just a conservation framework to protect these species from federal actions which may put them in jeopardy. The federal actions portion is very important. But the goal of the Endangered Species Act is really twofold. It's one, to help prevent these species from going extinct, but also help the species recover to the point where protections are no longer needed and they can move off the endangered species list. Just so you're familiar, I'm sure you've heard by now, but there are over 1,600 listed species and over 900 critical habitats around the country. Critical habitats are the areas that these species rely on to survive. So this is a very wide spatial footprint when we talk about the number of listed species throughout the United States. So the Endangered Species Act requires that a consultation take place with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Marine Fisheries if any federal action will put that endangered species at jeopardy of extinction. This is known as a Section 7 interagency cooperation, and it's put into place to ensure that the federal action does not harm the species or its habitat. The Endangered Species Act itself is really interesting because this is a federal law that has been interpreted very strictly over the last 50 years. Really, the language has not changed in the last 30 years, which is extremely unusual for a piece of legislation. So it's a very strict law that really has implications to touch any activity that affects wildlife, particularly sensitive wildlife. So I think it's important to point out that the Endangered Species Act really does come from a good place. Since the Endangered Species Act was put in place over 50 years ago, there have been several examples of successes. If you see up here, we have some very familiar species to us. These species have either come back from the brink of extinction, or by being placed on the Endangered Species Act list, they were prevented from even getting to that point. So again, the Endangered Species Act really does come from a good place of protecting species that are critical to our ecosystems. And I think it's just really important to recognize that as we move forward into talking about how pesticides fit into this. So when we talk about pesticides, there are 5 federal laws that dictate how pesticides can be used. The first is the FIFRA, Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. This law was put into place in 1947, and it regulates the production, the sale, registration, and use of pesticides. So this is probably the federal law that you're most familiar with when we start talking about pesticide use. Extremely important law, ensuring that pesticide use is safe in our production systems. The second federal law is the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, put in place in 2002. This law sets the tolerant or the maximum pesticide residues allowed in our food crops, so a very important law when it comes to protecting consumer safety. The Food Quality and Protection Act of 1996 evaluates pesticide exposure with special considerations to sensitive populations. Those populations include children and those with health concerns. So this is a very important law for protecting the consumer and those who could possibly be exposed to pesticide residues in the environment. The fourth federal law is the Pesticide Registration Improvement Act, or PREA. This law was put into place in 2003. This law really is put into place for our registrants to ensure that they have a fair timeline and registration fees. And then finally, the fifth federal law that all pesticides must comply with, been in place for over 50 years, is the Endangered Species Act, or ESA, put into place in 1973, but ensures that the use of pesticides does not harm these endangered species. So again, this has been in place for over 50 years, and unfortunately has been something that has been overlooked for the past 50 years. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So how does the EPA fit into this? How does pesticide use fit into the Endangered Species Act? Well, again, the EPA is the federal entity responsible for registration and re-registration of all pesticide products. Every pesticide product, whether it's initially registered or re-registered every 15 years, all pesticide products go through that process, is looked at by the EPA. They look at the toxicity, they look at the uses of those products, see how it's changed over time. And the EPA is required to ensure that the ESA, the Endangered Species Act, is not violated by pesticide use. Again, that's been required for the last 50 years. And they're required to reach this determination using the best available science. However, I think that we're all very familiar now, but the EPA has had decades-long challenges in meeting these ESA obligations. Most pesticides were registered without a formal ESA consultation process. This is due to limited time, limited resources, limited manpower, limited money, which means that a majority of our pesticide products over the last 50 years were registered or re-registered without a formal ESA consultation. Just for scale, there are over 1,200 registered active ingredients in the U.S. right now, and roughly 99% of those have not had a complete ESA consultation process done on them. So if you've seen any of these headlines in the news recently, this is just a few of the ones that I've saved. Some of the more popular press, ag magazines have put out some pretty scary headlines. The one that catches my attention the most is endangered herbicides, ? Understand how EPA's proposed herbicide strategy will impact use moving forward. And so there's been a lot of headlines recently, a lot of questions have been raised. Why are we just now hearing about the Endangered Species Act? This law has been in place since 1973. We've been using pesticides for that long. What has changed? Well, recent litigations have highlighted EPA's lack of compliance with the Endangered Species Act when registering or re-registering pesticide products. So that means the courts have now imposed deadlines on the EPA to bring these pesticide products into compliance. Herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, everything must be brought into compliance with the Endangered Species Act moving forward. All pesticide products will require this review in the upcoming years. This is court mandated. They have essentially had enough. There is no more lack of compliance. It's time that everything is brought into compliance with this law. Historically, this is an extremely long process. We're talking an ESA evaluation process can take up to 15 years on a pesticide product if it's extremely complex. So this is a very timely process. There is a lot of pesticides that have to be brought into compliance, and there is very little time and resources to do this. And so collectively, we must find a way to keep pesticides out of the court system, or courts will decide how we use our pesticide products. And I think we've learned over the last couple years, this is not what we want as an agriculture community. So what exactly does this mean? Well, right now, over 99% of our pesticide products are legally vulnerable. Most of these products do not have an ESA consultation process, therefore technically they are not in compliance with this federal law. So if they were to be sued, the label could possibly be vacated. We've seen examples of this over the last several years. We don't want to see it anymore. We've also seen proactive restrictions and regulations placed on pesticide products to prevent pesticide overlap with endangered species habitat. This is just to mitigate any potential ESA concerns. A couple examples of these I know we're familiar with are the use of downwind buffers for certain pesticide products in various parts of our state. We've also seen complete county restrictions of pesticide products in other areas, and this is again to prevent the potential overlap of pesticide use with the habitat of endangered species. So a couple of examples of how the EPA has proactively in the past tried to bring pesticides into compliance. However, this has really brought us to our current dilemma. How do we move forward? We're at a crossroads. Do we move forward and allow the court to continue to remove our tools that we need to use on the farm day after day? Or do we understand that we'll need additional regulations placed on the use of our products in order to allow us to use these in uncertain times? So what's next? All pesticide products will require an ESA review moving into the future. This is when a product is registered initially or when that product goes through re-registration. There is a lot of pesticide products that will need to be brought into compliance moving forward. And the EPA is exploring how to evaluate large groups of products very quickly, very efficiently, so that we can continue using these products on our farms while we're protecting endangered species. We are going to have to protect listed species moving forward. Again, these are protected under federal law, and so we are going to have to find a way that we can continue using pesticide products while still protecting these sensitive species and the critical habitats that they rely on to survive. And so protecting endangered species, especially those on or near agriculture lands, begins with preventing overlap of the pesticide product with that endangered species and its habitat. And there's 3 ways that the EPA has outlined that we will approach this moving into the future. The first is preventing the overlap of the pesticide product with the endangered species or its habitat. This is essentially removing an area with a listed species from the label. These are called pesticide use limitation areas, or PULAs. In the past, we've seen complete removal of entire counties on the label, but moving forward, we hope to see more refined areas rather than large spatial areas. We'd like to see smaller areas really that identify where that endangered species would be located, and then how can we mitigate the removal of the movement of the pesticide into the environment. So prevention of the pesticide overlap with the endangered species habitat is the first method for mitigating that exposure. The second is mitigation itself, adding spray drift or runoff mitigation requirements to the label to minimize species exposure. And the third is offset, by removing the species habitat and placing it in a different area so then that species habitat would not be exposed to the pesticide itself. So 3 different ways that the EPA has outlined that we will prevent the overlap of pesticide use and species habitat moving into the future. So pathway to compliance. Courts have mandated that EPA must bring all of these pesticide products into compliance very quickly. Again, it's a lot of pesticide products that must be brought into compliance over the next several years. So how does the EPA do that while still having the products available for us to use on the farm in a practical manner? Well, the EPA first released in November 2022 what's called their ESA work plan, which is really the document that outlined their plan to compliance. Then in 2023, they introduced the first part of their compliance plan, which was called the Vulnerable Species Pilot Program. This was a plan for addressing potential pesticide overlap with particularly vulnerable species. We haven't talked a lot about this in Georgia because right now it really doesn't affect us. But this program outlined particularly vulnerable species, which are species that have high sensitivity to environmental impacts. They may have sensitivity to pesticide use, and they have extremely small and concentrated populations. And so in this plan, the EPA outlined how they would address overlap of these species by really minimizing exposure to all pesticide products, fungicides, herbicides, and rodenticides. And then finally, in July of 2023, the EPA released its herbicide strategy, which really impacts us here in Georgia. That's what we're going to talk mostly about today. This was a plan to protect all species from herbicide exposure in conventional agriculture. This draft plan was released in 2023, and we're actually a little bit early today, but in a couple weeks we are expecting the release of the final plan, which will have all the details of how we're going to move forward with herbicide use in conventional agriculture. But the herbicide strategy, again, was EPA's plan to protect listed species from herbicide use in conventional agriculture. This plan focuses on reducing jeopardy or adverse modification to the endangered species and its habitat. So that's a lot of legal talk, but essentially we just have to prevent that species from being impacted by pesticide exposure. The herbicide strategy takes a look at all herbicides used in conventional agriculture and evaluates how they will impact listed species that are used in the vicinity of conventional agriculture practices. Really, this plan was put into place to increase the efficiency of the Fish and Wildlife consultation process. And doing this allows us to continue using pesticide products in a practical manner on the farm. But in the outline of the herbicide strategy focuses on preventing overlap of the pesticide product from occurring before it even happens. So we're focusing on proactive measures that minimize the exposure of the species. The first of those is preventing pesticide drift, and the second is by preventing runoff of the pesticide product out of the treated field into the habitat of the endangered species. So if you're interested, the herbicide strategy is posted on the federal docket. It was over a 900-page document that EPA put together on how they're going to address this pesticide exposure. It's quite extensive. I'll be happy to loan you my copy if you're interested in reading it. But it's really a tremendous document that outlined scientifically how to evaluate and minimize exposure of endangered species to these pesticide products while still trying to keep the use of the product as practical as possible. There was a lot of room for improvement, but I would just like to point out it was a tremendous scientific document that really put effort into keeping pesticide use practical for us on the farm. So historically, again, the ESA consultation process has been extremely extensive. It starts with a federal action, which is EPA registering the pesticide product, and it moves through a series of steps. EPA takes a look at how that pesticide product actually impacts the species itself. What's the toxicity? Where is it used? How long does it persist in the environment? They go through a series of steps, and they bring in Fish and Wildlife Service here at the end to determine how is this pesticide going to impact that species out in the environment from a population standpoint. Then the EPA must decide if and when how to register that product. How can we use that product following the consultation and the conversations with Fish and Wildlife Service. But overall, the point of this message is it's an extremely long process historically, 4 to 15 years, depending on what the herbicide is and what the use pattern is, what are the species that are sensitive, et cetera. And so it's just really important to recognize that based on the time scale that all of these pesticide products will have to be brought into compliance, there's no way that we can be protected from legal vulnerability during this time. And so in the herbicide strategy, the EPA outlined a new approach to evaluating herbicide impacts on endangered species, specifically first looking at the population level impacts. So what does the use across the whole conventional agriculture in the country look like on the population of that endangered species? They then look at what types of mitigation would be necessary to prevent any jeopardy or adverse modification to that population from occurring. And then the final step of that analysis is understanding where that mitigation will be necessary based on where the endangered species and its habitat is located at. So this proposed mitigation, minimizing spray drift and minimizing runoff out of a treated field, are practices that we would have to implement on the farm when potential impacts to endangered species or their habitat were identified. And this really focuses first on the toxicity of that particular product. So what does it actually do to the species itself? What does it do to the environment? How long does it live? How long does it persist? What does that herbicide do to the food that endangered species relies on to survive? So it takes a look at the whole system itself. We'll then have to take a look at where the actual product will be used at. Is it a product that's used in cotton? Is it corn? Is it peanut? Is it a pre? Is it a post? What time of year is it going out? This will all play into what types of mitigations will be necessary. We then need to understand where exactly the endangered species are located at themselves. That is a very important part of this. The geospatial overlap of the pesticide use depends on where those endangered species are identified to be located at. That's a very important part of this puzzle. And then finally, how do all of these factors interact? This will determine where mitigation measures will be necessary. And again, the goal of these mitigation measures is to reduce species exposure below a toxic level so we don't see toxicity to the population of that endangered species. So if we visited during UPW this year using Pesticide Wisely this past spring, we shared most of this information with you, kind of what it was looking like for the herbicide strategy moving forward. I would like to tell you there's been an update from the EPA since we met last. The herbicide strategy, that document, the 900-page document itself, received over 18,000 public comments during the comment period. EPA has gone through all of those comments. There were 250 unique comments themselves, and the EPA actually released a document this past April that addressed a lot of the concerns that the public has expressed on the herbicide strategy. Again, here in Georgia, we had extensive comments provided to EPA from UGA specialists, from extension agents, Georgia farmers. So thank you so much for being involved. It truly made a difference. The EPA heard the concerns of the herbicide strategy and is working to address those to make sure that this plan is something that is practical to use on the farm. Again, this update was released in April of this year, April 16th, and it addressed the concerns brought forth by the public from the herbicide strategy, and it also indicated what was being reevaluated within the herbicide strategy and would likely change before August. So August 30th is the final release of the herbicide strategy, and we'll likely see some changes even between now and then. So I've incorporated into these next couple slides the changes that the EPA provided in the April update, so it may look a little bit different from what we saw at UPW this year. But again, the first type of mitigation that we are going to be required to implement on the farm if we are in an area where endangered species are concerned is by minimizing spray drift out of the treated field. So when we talked at UPW this year, we talked about how a downwind buffer was going to be needed between the last treated row and the beginning of the endangered species habitat. This language has changed a little bit, so now we are expecting that the condition of habitat of the listed species will be removed from the buffer, and we will now see a buffer required between the last treated row. This is going to depend on your application method. So again, we're still waiting on some clarity from the final strategy. We don't know if these distances are going to remain the same, but we do know that there's going to be different buffer distances required between your application methods. So if you're using an aerial, ground, or air blast application, the amount of buffer that you'll be required to implement may be a little bit different. We do expect, however, to see some buffer reduction from different application methods, including hooded sprayers and windbreaks. We don't know exactly by how much yet, but we are expecting to see a little bit relief from that buffer by using one of those application methods. But again, between now and next month, the EPA continues to refine these mitigation options for spray drift, so we still will see some changes yet. But I was excited to see the definition of a buffer change slightly in the April update. Again, they've removed, from what we are anticipating, they've removed the requirement of the endangered species habitat from the buffer description. We will see now a spray drift buffer begins where the application ends. So that was really exciting to see. You can see here the definition of what can be included in that downwind buffer. Again, this is still a proposed definition. We expect some changes between now and August, but that is encouraging that we'll see some adjustment there. The second type of mitigation that will be required to implement on the farm, again, if there is a threat of that herbicide product leaving the field and entering the habitat of an endangered species, is by mitigating runoff and erosion, just collectively referring to that as runoff. But the scenario here is there is a threat from that herbicide running out of the field following a rainfall or a wind event and entering into the species of the listed species, of the endangered or the threatened species. This is where it gets a little bit complicated. If this is the case, if there is a threat of that herbicide running out of the treated field and entering into the habitat of the species, depending on where you're located, the grower, the pesticide applicator, will be required to implement a certain number of mitigation practices to prevent that from happening. So the number of practices will depend on the level of mitigation that will need to be reached. So this is a little bit of an update since April. So we won't know exactly how much mitigation will be needed until the herbicide goes through the evaluation process and they determine its toxicity, what's it going to do to the species, how long does it persist, etc. So the level of mitigation that will be needed will be determined by the herbicide product and what cropping system that you're using it in. So once you know what level of mitigation you are going to need, we previously have been referring to this as the point system, so you may be more familiar with that. You'll go to a mitigation menu and you'll select a number of practices that will get you to that level of mitigation that you need. These practices are being ranked on their efficacy, what's their efficacy in mitigating the runoff out of that field into the environment, and they're going to be given a designation of none, low, medium, and high. We think that there's going to be a point value associated with it. It's still a little bit unclear, but we'll know for sure next month. We'll definitely relay that information to you. But we are expecting a tiered value within those actual mitigation options. So say you're using cover crops. There may be a low, medium, high depending on the amount of biomass that you have accumulated with your cover crop. So we are expecting some tiered options there, which is extremely optimistic. However, we will be required to implement these practices depending on the herbicide, what level of mitigation that we need, and what's our cropping system. So just something to keep in mind moving forward. Okay, so this is all still proposed, but this is the last example of the proposed mitigation menu that we've seen. We have a lot of options on here that I think will be really flexible for agronomic growers. We have field management practices, looking at things like contour farming, cover cropping, grass waterways, filter strips. How do you manage your irrigation water? Do you use terraces? Things like that. So there'll be an associated point value given for each of those practices. We have things like field characteristics, which we've seen an update in. Previously, flat fields were defined as less than 2% slope, but that has been updated to less than 3% slope. We have application parameters and other options available. But since April, we have received additional options that are being suggested to add to the mitigation menu, and those are listed here. A couple things I think will be really helpful for us in cotton production here in Georgia. But this is a list of options that will continue to evolve over time. So it's not the end all be all. There will be additional options that are added over time as more data comes in from scientists across the country. Essentially, this is a starting place. So if you have any ideas, let us know so we can work on getting the data together to support having the option added to the mitigation menu. So another important component, we've talked a lot about this, so I won't spend too much time on Bulletins Live 2, but this is going to be how EPA communicates ESA restrictions to us moving forward. There's going to be a little blurb on the label directing you to go to the Bulletins Live 2 website to check if you have an ESA restriction. You'll go to the website, you'll find where your field is, you'll look and see if you have a restriction in your area. Right now those show up in red. We haven't seen any changes since UPW in that regard, but if you need any help accessing or navigating Bulletins Live 2, please get in touch with your county agent and we'll be glad to help facilitate that process. But it's really important to understand that Bulletins Live 2 is going to be where these restrictions will be located at. So I'm just gonna, I think I'm getting close on time, but I'm gonna keep on going a little bit. So a lot of these details are going to change between now and August. August is when we'll have our final herbicide strategy released, but we will see some key elements remain no matter what the details do. We are going to have to prevent drift and runoff. There's no way around it. Record keeping is going to be critical. We have to protect ourselves, and so the records you start keeping now will only protect you moving into the future. And then Bulletins Live 2, of course, is going to be critical that we understand how to navigate that site. Again, August 30th, the final herbicide strategy will be released. This is how the EPA is going to comply with ESA moving forward for all herbicides. We will communicate with you in August the details of the final strategy, specifically around the mitigation menu and the point value associated, conservation program compatibility. If you're working with NRCS, I know there's a lot of questions about that, and what the pesticide use limitation areas are going to look like. But now and beyond August 30th, of course, the University of Georgia will continue to remain involved and engaged in this process. So just a couple things as I start to wrap up. The university, UGA has stayed very involved in helping regulators understand what goes on Georgia farms. We've done a lot of collaborative projects with EPA and Fish and Wildlife in the last couple years, helping them understand pesticide use in Georgia, but also understand that we can help generate data that really shows where pesticide use and endangered species habitat overlap and where they don't overlap. So we've had a really neat project going on with Fish and Wildlife over the last couple years, looking at the endless duo restrictions and the 2 endangered species that triggered that restriction. Working with Fish and Wildlife Service, we gathered a lot of information looking at the particular habitat requirements of that species and looking to see, can we really understand where pesticide use overlaps, the areas that are the habitat of that species, and can we generate the maps that show that we don't have the pesticide overlap originally thought, but we can identify where species might be located so that we can work to protect those sites instead. Through this work, we showed that instead of a complete county-wide restriction across the state of Georgia, across the 11 counties that were restricted, by looking at the particular habitat requirements of the endangered species, we could actually reduce that footprint by over 99%, really helping free up pesticide use in areas where endangered species really weren't a concern. And so we're really excited to continue this work. Glyphosate is the next herbicide that our focus is moving towards. It's currently undergoing re-registration right now, and so we'll see ESA restrictions coming along for that product in the future. But just know we are aggressively working on understanding the pesticide footprint in the state. Can we understand where the pesticide is used in relation to where the endangered species that are sensitive to this product are located at? And so continuing this work to try and really keep this pesticide and the utility in the state for Georgia. A couple of the research projects that are underway working to really address the mitigation menu itself, looking at additional mitigation options that may be suitable for Georgia. Again, if you're doing something very creative on your farm, we'd love to hear about it so that we can start doing research to address that option and get it on the list. Looking at ways to minimize runoff and minimize pesticide spray drift out of the treated field, just to improve our applications, the utility of your products, but also keep pesticide use practical for us on the farm. Again, work is ongoing, collaboration continues. We're working to understand pesticide overlap. We're working to contribute to the best available science that is for the state of Georgia. But what data can we provide that really improves listed species protections, protects practical pesticide use, and helps preserve the sustainability of family farms? That's what we're focused on right now. So to do that, we need your help. I'm not going to give you a UPW refresher up here today, but if you need one, let me know. I'll be glad to give you a refresher. But just remember the concepts that we covered during using pesticides wisely this spring. It is more important than ever that we keep pesticide products on target, that we use the correct product in the formulations, and we protect our sensitive areas, because quite literally, the future of our pesticide use depends on our ability to do the correct practices now. So this is a group effort. It requires everybody. It requires cooperation of the chemical companies, the regulatory agencies, the agencies responsible for the listed species themselves, and then us, the end users. It requires us all being on the same page, working together to keep these products practical to use on the farm. So my last couple slides, take-home message, don't panic. This is coming, but the rollout is going to take time. So this is just an example of the registration, re-registration process. There's a lot of steps. There's a lot of public comments that happen along the way. So this is a process that takes over a year from start to finish. So even if this was to go into date today, it would be well over a year before we saw the first restrictions come out. So just don't panic. You know, we're working to get all the information together to use, so that way when it is time, you have all the information that you need to be successful and comply. So how can you prepare now? Get familiar with Bulletins Live 2 if you're not already. Keep detailed records of what you're doing. Think about, are you keeping track of the conservation practices that you use on the farm? Do you keep track of your cover crop, your grass waterways, things like that? If you don't do that, I would highly encourage you to just start keeping records of what you're doing, the applications that you put out. I know you already do that, But it's just really important to have those records to protect yourself if anything was to happen in the future. So great practice to start now. Stay in touch with your county agent. They'll have all the information for you as these things come out. And then finally, please practice good pesticide stewardship practices. The future of our pesticide use depends on it. This is my last slide for real this time. As I finish up, just think going into the future. I know you all do a lot of these things on your farm already, but what could you do moving into the future that would help you mitigate the movement of pesticides or pollutants off your land and into the environment? What could you incorporate that you've seen on the mitigation menu that you don't already do? Now that you have a couple years flexibility before these regulations come to be, it's a great time to start experimenting with some things that you may be interested in and could help get you some more mitigation credit moving into the future. So I just encourage you to think about some of these things as we go into the future. If you need any help with any of these options, please get in touch with your county agent and we'll be glad to help you however we can. So that's all I have today. Thank you for the opportunity to come. If there's any questions, I know I'm probably out of time, but I'll be around for a little while. I'll be glad to talk to you and appreciate your support of this work.